This example is about a real business cycle. Consider a real business cycle model. It draws the economy in equilibrium in its aggregate demand, aggregate supply space. Consider a negative shock in productivity. Identify the new equilibrium by shifting the appropriate curves. So we'll draw our y-axis, which is the price level, our x-axis, which is our output level, and this is our downward aggregate demand curve, and this is our vertical line, which is the long run aggregate supply. We don't draw short run aggregate supply or medium run aggregate supply because with the real business cycle we focus mainly on potential output, and that's why we draw the long run aggregate supply. So the point of y1 star is our potential output or full employment output, and this is the output level at long run aggregate supply. So the point of intersection between the long run aggregate supply and aggregate demand will give us our price level, which is B1. In the question, it was mentioned that we have a negative shock in productivity. So this means that it will affect our long run aggregate supply. Therefore, long run aggregate supply will shift to the left. Consequently, we will have a new point of intersection between the new long run aggregate supply, we can write it here, long run aggregate supply 2, and aggregate demand. And this will give us point B here, which will give us a price level, which is B2, which is higher than B1. And now we have a new potential output or a new full employment output, which is Y2 star. Therefore, our new potential output is lower. Y2 star is lower than Y1 star, and our price level is higher. B2 is bigger than B1. The second part of the question is, assume that the central bank tries to offset the effects of the shock. Represent graphically the effect of the central bank intervention. So usually with central bank intervention, it means that we use a monetary policy. So since we have a lower output, it means that we're going to use an expansionary monetary policy. And with this expansionary monetary policy, we will have open market operation, and we will go with open market purchase, which means central bank will purchase treasury bonds and in return will give money to the public, which means it will increase money supply, it will increase liquidity. So money supply will be higher, which would result in lower interest. Consequently, aggregate demand will shift to the right because at a lower interest, investment will increase because of the reverse crowding out. Consequently, aggregate demand will be higher. So aggregate demand will shift to the right. So when we shift aggregate demand to the right, we will have a new point of intersection between the new aggregate demand, which is aggregate demand 2, and the new long run aggregate supply, which is long run aggregate supply 2. So this point of intersection would result in a higher price, which is B3. Therefore, it would result in a higher price because B3 is bigger than B2 is bigger than B1. Therefore, as you see here that our policy here, when we used monetary policy, usually all policy affect aggregate demand, and that's why here it affected the price level, but it didn't affect the output level. The next part of the question is that intervention successful? Motivate your answer. We know that anytime we have a policy intervention, either fiscal policy or monetary policy, this will affect our aggregate demand. Therefore, aggregate demand will shift to the right or to the left. Therefore, in real business cycle, our output is at potential output, which means our long run aggregate supply. Therefore, we'll discover that any intervention, it will affect only aggregate demand. Consequently, it will impact the price level, not the output level. Therefore, here, when we had an expansionary monetary policy, it resulted in higher price, but our potential output remains the same. Therefore, no policy intervention in our real business cycle model will have an impact on output. In addition, since people apply rational expectations, therefore the public will anticipate the impact of this policy and they will adjust their prices and wages accordingly. Therefore, our output will always remain at full employment output or potential output. The next part of the question is, now consider a negative demand shock from the initial equilibrium. So we return back to our initial equilibrium without the negative shock in productivity. And we'll assume that we will have instead a negative demand shock. Identify the new equilibrium and discuss whether the central bank can be successful in bringing back the economy at the initial equilibrium. So we'll draw here our y-axis, which is the price level, our x-axis, which is our output level. This is our downward aggregate demand curve, and this is our vertical line, which is the long run aggregate supply, and this will give us our potential output, which is y1 star. And here we have the point of intersection, point A, it will give us the price level, which is B1. Since we have a negative demand shock, so this means that aggregate demand will shift to the left. So lower aggregate demand would result in a new point of intersection between the new aggregate demand, which is aggregate demand 2, and long run aggregate supply. This will be point B. It will give us here a lower price, which is B2. So I know that B2 will be lower than B1, but output remains the same at potential output. So I know that the new output is equal to our potential output, which is Y1 star. Then let's talk about the policy. What will happen if we apply an expansionary monetary policy using open market operations? We will use open market purchase. Therefore, we will increase money supply. Consequently, interest rate will be lower. Lower interest rate will increase investment. Once investment increases, this would result in higher aggregate demand. So if aggregate demand will increase, it means that aggregate demand will shift to the right. It would return back to our original equilibrium at point A. So at point A, what will happen? Our price will increase from B2 to B1, but will return back to our potential output. Therefore, is this policy successful? Yes, because we shifted aggregate demand. Consequently, if we use any policy, we know that fiscal policy and monetary policy affects aggregate demand. Therefore, it's very easy to return back to the original equilibrium by using these policies.